All right. Everything should be golden, I believe. Um, so, for those of you tuning in, I'm gonna first off make a quick sound check. Make some noise or something, Sterling.
Sure. Can you hear me
Make
okay?
some noise or something, Sterling.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep. All right. Cool. Everything's chill. Um, the general subject of today's stream um, is going to be based on some stuff that got started in one of my anti spaces on Twitter. And the general vibe we're talking here is how to gain freedom nowish, basically. Because, like, there's plenty of plans of, like, oh, well, what do we do uh, in order, like, once anarchy is achieved? What do we do once we get rid of government? All this stuff. That's theory for for basically later. What we've got now is the possibility to do something now. And for those of you who are patience challenged, that's certainly a draw. And for those of you who watch as the state strips and more away from you on a daily basis, that's also a draw. So hopefully we can address both audiences at this particular point. Sterlin, why don't you introduce yourself? Let us know what got you started in this stuff. My guest Sterlin Lujan is going to talk about panarchy, network states, parallel societies, and a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, Jeremiah, thanks for having me on, my man. So I'll give you just a brief hit of my background. So I think we've talked about this on your space a little bit, right? I got into it a bit maybe. So in 2009, I was actually arrested for possession of MDMA and cocaine, something like 500 pills of MDMA. And that experience, having that direct engagement with the state apparatus, actually woke me up. It snapped me out of like a consensus trance that I was in, right? And I wasn't really doing much with my life at the time. I dropped out of college, wasn't really thinking for myself at all, was just going through the motions, like the lackadaisical workaday kind of life.
Mm-hmm.
That experience, though, drove me to start reading for not just pleasure, but to actually learn and to understand things. I wanted to grow my knowledge. And of course, in doing that, that experience, plus also having experimented with MDMA, is part of it as well. And it got me to question the nature of the drug laws. That was one of the very first things that started me on this path toward anarchy. I asked a question: why is this chemical compound that is so interesting and so helpful and potentially helpful for people who are suffering, why is it illegal? Right. So that was the question that really
Mm.
intrigued me, and that's one of the reasons I got arrested for possessing that amount, because I started sharing them with my friends. It turned into a little business. And then but I didn't fully consolidate and form my philosophical opinion until after I got arrested. And that's when I started reading people like Murray Rothbard. I read for Anatomy of the State. And then Stefan Molyneux was popular during the time before he went completely, ideologically right-winged. But I really liked his book, Practical Anarchy, and his other book, Everyday Anarchy, and that was pretty influential. And then over time, my views have evolved quite significantly from more anarcho-capitalist type of perspectives to more panarchic and agoristic type perspectives. So anyway, that's a bit of my history, and through that process, I also got into the cryptocurrency ecosystem. I started working in the space back in 2015. I had heard originally about Bitcoin in 2013, and of course, my original interest around it was for its crypto anarchic values, right? The fact that it could liberate us financially, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really how I got into the space and how I started thinking about these ideas. So I've been in libertarianism, in anarchism for well over a decade. I'm probably going to start working on two pretty soon, right?
Yeah. Yeah, similar. Yeah. Anybody who knows me knows that this channel is, sort of surface start of, like, the amount that I've gone back in these circles, and I've heard about you for a significant period of time. Um, and in general, like, the cryptocurrency aspect of it is probably going to lead significantly into what we're discussing today. Because, if I understand correctly, a key part of of your like sort of approach to network states came about through your work with cryptos. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of people sort of in the network state movement. We'll get into definitions and history and philosophy and all that in a moment, but just a tidbit here. A, this whole movement is really, it was born out of the cryptocurrency ecosystem, the blockchain ecosystem, and this is kind of how it played out. A lot of folks in the US, specifically to some degree in Europe, got really disillusioned with the regulatory environment. And this is also to state that a lot of people in the crypto space are what we call quote unquote crypto anarchists, or support quote unquote cypherpunkism, or being a cypherpunk, which is just somebody who writes codes to protect and uphold civil liberties and to help protect people's privacy and anonymity online, just for anybody who doesn't know. So what ended up happening, because the regulations became so onerous and the US government started going after so many people en masse, what the community decided was necessary was we need our own spaces and our own free spaces to develop our technology and to try to insulate ourselves from state attacks. We don't want to be thwarted by them. We want to be able to work on our technologies, and we want to do it as freely as possible. Even if it's not as free as we would like, we still want to start initiating some type of parallel, quote unquote, parallel society, or some type of ecosystem where we can work. So this is what was, in just a little bit of, now maybe it's a good time to get into the history just a little bit. So the original people who talked about these ideas were the crypto anarchists. If you're, I assume your audience is probably familiar with people like Timothy May, Eric Hughes, and Jerry Everhard, who is like a quasi crypto anarchist.
They
So in
are, but
yeah,
like as much elaboration as you can offer with any of these, because there could be people who need a primer.
yeah, sure. Yeah, this is important information. So in Timothy May, he's what you would call the godfather of crypto anarchism. He's really well known for writing a short manifesto called the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto. And the aim of that piece of literature is that we should do whatever we can to protect an individual's rights online as well as physically. But his focus was primarily online. And the idea is that crypto anarchists and cypherpunks write code to protect civil liberties. And just one example of what this code looks like, there's a technology called PGP that was written
Mm-hmm.
by Philip Zimmermann, and that's just pretty good privacy is what it stands for. And it was one of the first email encrypted privacy protocols. And one of the things that happened in the 90s when this was happening, this is the so-called crypto wars. There's a really good book on this by Stephen Levy called Crypto Wars. But Zimmerman ended up having to go to court to defend himself because he was spreading his technology, his protocol PGP around. And one of the things he got in, I forget the name of the law, but basically the government tried to claim that strong encryption protocols are akin to munitions for export purposes. So I think he tried to take, because he was moving the technology around and handing it out to people, it of course crossed international borders, and now he's being charged with moving around munitions, right, exporting it. So I think this was a huge case. He ended up getting exonerated, right? It worked out in his favor, and as a result, the crypto anarchists and cypherpunks really won the crypto wars against the government in the 90s. And there were some other things that happened as well, because the government was trying to keep strong encryption and cryptography technologies to themselves. They wanted to own all the mechanisms and all the knowledge behind how cryptography works. But of course, the private sector, a couple of private sector crypto anarchists actually brought public-private key cryptography to the public because they discovered it separately outside the scope of the government. Their names are Whitfield Diffie, and the other guy's slipping my mind right now. He's like one of the main ones, but Diffie is one of the primary ones. Hellman, right? Hellman and Diffie. These are the guys who brought PGP to the world. And so this is a bunch of different things happening in the 90s that allowed this technology to come to fruition. And then Timothy May around the same time started talking about a couple of different acts and actions by government to try to curtail strong cryptography, and also to enact a surveillance state, or what David Chaum and other people have called a dossier society, where the government tries to tabulate and keep records on every single citizen and person. And all this led up to a situation where these guys started writing very strongly about crypto anarchy, and they started doing everything in their power to tell people to write code to protect our online rights, our right to privacy, our right to access information, our right not to be censored, and to maintain some element of censorship resistance. So all of these ideas, these characteristics, these values, they have lived on, right, into the modern day with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, right? These are just a continuation of those cypherpunk and crypto anarchist values, right? A lot of the guys who wrote some of the early code for Bitcoin, along with Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever that is, ends up being, right? It's an enigmatic person, it's a pseudonym. But people like David Chaum, so ultimately kind of contributed to some the ideas behind digital cash or eCash. And Adam Back, who's still speaking in the Bitcoin community, was an OG crypto anarchist and cypherpunk. So all of these people had an idea in their head, and that idea was, we have to maintain freedom online, and we have to prevent government from surveilling everybody en masse. And that was a really important driver or catalyst for their overarching philosophical vision. And so these guys really, they set the stage for where we're at today.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of where we're at today, like, one of the key things that sort of started to open my eyes in a lot of ways was the Snowden leaks, the existence of WikiLeaks, all of these things that really started to open eyes on how much our privacy was being intruded on. And one of the things that I remember being striking that fits right into something like PGP is the idea that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, coming from the government, who hides basically fucking everything. And to me, that striking hypocrisy was a huge factor in my willingness to help seed those leaks as torrents and help get that information out there. And generally speaking, I believe firmly that all you have to do to red pill somebody is show them just how much the government is surveilling everything. It's one of the reasons that I'm so opposed to the primary uses of AI and that sort of thing, because it's like the AI surveillance state is being built around us. Trump is giving $500 million to Oracle and Larry Ellison and all of these people who are directly supportive of a drone-based facial recognition camera, whatever, super state that can monitor us and track us wherever we go. So obviously anything that could help us get free from that would be awesome. So do you mind discussing briefly the reasons, maybe from a sort of Sterlin Lujan, but sort of Naomi Brockwell kind of cypherpunk kind of thing, why PGP was so radical and why we should support things like it?
Yeah, and this actually will probably dovetail nicely into the reason that network states eventually came to fruition. But the idea there is why it's so radical is because they realized, well, the cypherpunks, crypto anarchists realized very early on that if we don't do something about this right now, the government is going to completely get their claws into our daily lives, right? And that's already happened to a large degree, as you mentioned, with the Snowden leaks, which ultimately were also provided and provisioned from WikiLeaks, right? And Assange. And by the way, Assange was one of the original cypherpunks as well, who was on the cypherpunk mailing list, which was a mailing list in the 90s. But the idea is we have to do something. We can't be complacent. We can't sleep on this. If we do, we're going to be fully and totally controlled. I mean, things are bad right now still, right, with regard to government surveillance, and we know that. but at least we do have some tools and mechanisms that survived as a result of the crypto wars that ultimately help protect us. So that kind of brings us to where we're at right now in terms of the historical arc of the network state and the parallel society movement. So what the network state movement has been called by a few actors in the space is the crypto end game. I'll repeat that, the crypto end game. So what that means is it's really challenging and really difficult. Maybe we can talk a little bit about this. It's really challenging and really difficult to completely escape surveillance, right? And that's primarily for the reasons that you mentioned, because a large chunk of the internet and the technologies and the platforms that we used are highly centralized, they're highly controlled, they're data monitors. So it's especially social media platforms, right? So it's really difficult for a person to go completely dark online. But I think there's this idea in the crypto anarchist space that has been circulating in recent years. It's this notion of lunar punk, right? And lunar punk is the philosophy that we should, if we can, gain complete anonymity in order to conceal ourselves in its entirety. We should do that. And the reason that idea is circulating because the technologies are now emerging that are giving us the ability to conceal ourselves and only to reveal ourselves when we see fit. And we don't have to get into technical details or anything like that, but the technology that's starting to enable this, that people are building platforms around, and that also is applicable to the network state, is called ZKPs, or zero knowledge proofs, or what we call zero knowledge cryptography, which is extremely powerful. And right now we're on the bleeding edge, and a lot of people in the space, there's whole research organizations with mathematical wizards and people that specialize in zero knowledge working on these problems right now, and figuring out how we can apply them to our decentralized platforms and applications. So we haven't even been able to fully roll out these technologies in a way that is scalable, in a way that everyone can just very easily embrace, right? A lot of problems around any of this tech, any of this P2P decentralized tech, is its usability is often hamstrung, right? Because it's so new, it takes time for it to gain a user base with the general population. And even then, a lot of times the general population has to be educated in how to use it.
It took so long to get my father and sister on board with like even something like Signal, and my mother still won't even use it, even though like the government is literally telling people at this point, do not use unencrypted comms. The Chinese hacked us. Everything is fucked.
Yeah, yeah, it's really difficult to be out there online. I mean, even myself, speaking personally, being a public person, I go to a lot of conferences and provide a lot of talks, and I just kind of assume that if I'm engaging online, if I'm doing a talk, or if I'm putting out content, that it's just all public and digestible. So that's not to say that I don't have a more private or anonymous life, but it's almost like you have to have a double life, right? If you're going to be anon, you have a part of you that's anon, and you have a part of you that's public. Now there are a handful of people out there who are really technically proficient, and they understand the strengths and the weaknesses of the privacy protocols that we currently have, and they try to leverage that. I think just a side note is there's a lot of people in the early days of Bitcoin that kind of assumed that Bitcoin was anonymous, right? The reality is that Bitcoin is barely, vaguely pseudonymous, right? Because there are organizations out there that can trace through Bitcoin transactions with ease and have really powerful techniques called clustering techniques, where they can de-anonymize transactions very easily. Yep. And they can trace transactions. Just to name of a couple of these popular companies. So Chainalysis is one, CipherTrace is another one, and this is a reason why a lot of people have started promoting very heavily technologies or cryptocurrencies like Monero, which are private by default, right? Default mode privacy, and even anonymity if you actually want it. Monero is probably the king of that, with some of these zero knowledge. I mentioned zero knowledge tech, or zero knowledge cryptocurrency coins as well, like Zcash, that are gaining more popularity. Although they may have some weaknesses compared to Monero, but that's kind of the state of play in terms of where we're at with crypto and decentralized P2P tech.
Yeah, and Zcash, whenever they say they're probably talking zero knowledge in this particular case, implementing ZK Snarks protocol, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the primary use case of zero knowledge is privacy, because the idea, and just so the audience knows, if anybody's not familiar with zero knowledge proofs, the idea is that you can reveal certain information about yourself at your leisure while concealing the rest, right? Or you can just keep it completely concealed. And so that's a very powerful technology. It relies, if we talk just a little bit about the math, it relies on polynomials and the symmetry between the answer and the question in terms of the polynomial. That's typically how it works. So, of course, I'm not a mathematician. It goes a lot deeper than that, but just generally speaking. So maybe now too is a good time to we can get into a little bit about how this ironed out with the ideas behind the network state.
Absolutely.
If we're so inclined.
Yeah, so like what is the network state? We'll start with definitions.
Yeah, okay. So, and I'm going to come back to, it's good that we talked about the cypherpunks, so I'm going to come back in a moment. We're going to discuss briefly something that Timothy May had to say. But the term network state was coined by the Coinbase former CTO named Balaji Srinivasan. A lot of people have heard of him. He has over 1 million followers on X. He's a well-known personality. He was also a professor at Stanford, and he wrote a book by the same name called The Network State. You can actually read it for free, thenetworkstate.com. Now, this is how Balaji defines the term, and then we'll pick apart the terminology and we'll analyze it, look at it. So he said that a network state is a group of people who come together online. They form a community online. And typically this group of people, they share values, they have a common philosophy, they have what he calls a quote-unquote one commandment or a driving goal or driving desire. They also engage in things like mimetic warfare, right? They're posting memes constantly. They're a community, right? They have almost a relationship, almost an emotional relationship. Now, one thing that Balaji says with these communities now is that they're together, they're formed, and now they're starting to get into a place where they're developing governance or rules of behavior or ways to resolve conflicts within those communities. And they may at some point want to take this community and beam it down to the land, right? So they want to establish a physical presence somewhere. So he would say something like I forget the exact, I'm going to paraphrase, but it's something akin to internet first, land second, but not land never. So something akin to that is the way that Balaji phrases it, where you don't necessarily have to get land, but there's a chance that you may want to, and that's a really difficult thing to do. But he himself is doing it right now. He and I was actually there. So outside of Singapore, he started the network school, right? Which is his goal of creating one of the first network states, right? Which is all of his community that typically tend to gravitate around him. And he set that up on the ground outside of Singapore. And actually he's in the second iteration, or it's kind of currently a pop-up, but it's operating in a special financial zone or a special economic zone. And we can talk more about that in a moment as well. But this is kind of how he defines it. Now, there's a key part to his definition that I personally disagree with, and a lot of people in the space also disagree with. He would claim that in order to officially be a network state, or the final end goal of a network state is to gain diplomatic recognition, right? So these network states need to appeal to the United Nations and the global powers and say, hey, I want to have actual powers. I want to have independence. I want to have Westphalian sovereignty. And
Right.
The idea is they're large enough, right, where they can, and they have enough power and momentum where they can gain that. But that's very clearly playing with the big boys, wanting to become an actual country or an actual government. Now, this is where I can step back and we go back to the crypto anarchists a bit. So one key thing about Balaji's work, I read his book twice, and some parts I read very carefully because it's one of the first really fully fleshed out books on the network state, on this idea, right? But when I got to looking into the history, I realized that the first, and I kind of sort of had a hunch about this before I got into it, but few people are talking about this. The first people to talk about the idea of a network state, just using different terminology, were the crypto anarchists, right? So everyone who knows Timothy May knows about the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto, but he wrote a very obscure paper also around 1992 called Libertaria in Cyberspace. And in this document, it's not very long, it's probably 1,000 words or so, he talks about the idea of creating governance models, basically just a rule set for cypherpunks or crypto anarchists so they can get along and resolve disputes in cyberspace, right? In this empire of the mind, to use my friend Max Border's phrase, where they're or Bruce Sterling's phrase, or these islands in the net, which are communities that grow and they gain power, like counter power of their own, to push back against the state apparatus. And so that was his thesis in libertarian cyberspace, and he called it crypto libertaria, where it has all of these crypto-based technologies that protect and conceal the individual. So all the cypherpunk values that we talked about are embedded. And he would actually say, he didn't even mention anything about land. Timothy said that everything involved in these islands in the web, this crypto libertaria, is simply online. The power structures exist online and are solely online.
So, actually, that's a sort of a way to maybe broaden this slightly. I believe his name is pronounced David Chaum. Uh, like, would you say that he also played into sort of the roots of this?
Yeah, for sure. So Cham is a known cypherpunk. I actually met him recently I think it was in Amsterdam
Hmm.
briefly, and he gave a talk. But yes, he plays more, I would say more specifically into the development of, well, I think his thing was actually called eCash. It was a digital cash variation. He was trying to do the Bitcoin thing early on. So he was definitely a predecessor of Bitcoin. But all of his thinking indeed was around gaining additional privacy, having anonymity, protecting the individual from government overreach, all the kind of hallmarks of the crypto anarchist mindset he had and he kept close to his heart. So, but I've never heard, and don't, this isn't a suggestion of what his views actually are or if he said anything about, I just don't know if he said anything about network states or cyber states previously.
Gotcha.
But I do want to say that this idea, its genesis, right, its origin stories with the crypto anarchists and cypherpunks, and here's where this is an important part of this discussion. So Balaji left all of this out of his book, and I don't know whether to chalk that up to the fact that he just missed it because it is obscure. It seems unlikely. He's an extremely well-read person. He speaks a lot about the ideas, etc., or if he simply doesn't like them. And I think that actually ends up being more of the truth. So his viewpoints probably align more with and we can get into this, you're probably very familiar with it, but with people like Curtis Yarvin's views, who
Mm-hmm.
want like a techno kind of dictatorship to rule the world. And I don't want to put words into Balaji's mouth because he does have a lot of good ideas too, and he shared a lot of good thoughts, but he would certainly not align with full-on libertarianism or anarchism or agorism like we would. So that's like a gap in his philosophy, and that's because the book was really influential to me, and there was nothing in there that seemed overtly like techno-fascist or awful, right? It was all about trying, because he's an interesting character. A lot of the material that he has and a lot of things that he talks about are the decline of the Western world, right? And he even has been speaking out against some aspects of the Trump regime, and he's not a fan of tariffs and all this stuff. And he's more like a fan of China and the Singapore model, which are also bad and awful in their own way. So anyway,
Yeah.
it's a nuanced conversation to say the least. But I will say that he definitely left out any mention of the cypherpunks and crypto anarchists, who, in my opinion, deserve all the credit when it comes to the formative attitudes and ideas that build the firm.
Um, you're muted now for some reason. I don't know, maybe something unplugged. Or there you go.
Oh yeah, it was weird. Okay, got it. Yeah, yeah. Cool, cool. All right. Yeah, the point is that he missed out on this part of the idea for whatever reason for network states, and the cypherpunks in my own research have were the ones who initiated. And by the way, if anybody wants to go to the crypto anarchy Wikipedia page, I actually added the entry for the network state section, and I gave all the credit to the actual crypto anarchists and cypherpunks who started, and of course Balaji's mentioned for expanding the idea. And
Very
by the
cool.
way, just one other piece of history. There's a couple of other places where the original idea was discussed. It was okay. So a lot of people know about this. It's a revelatory book, and it's extremely popular in like crypto anarchist circles. But the Sovereign Individual, that
Mm.
book,
I've heard of
also
it, but I have not read it.
highly recommended. Those guys actually also talked about these digital formations and the information age leading to these governance networks and structures. I think they used a term like autonomous formations, digital formations, and things like that. So that's one, and that book was written I think around 2000, and then also around the same time Everhard wrote the book Virtual States, which contains a similar thesis. So you can see the idea and its roots have been around in a more fully formed fashion since the 2000s. And we can either, I don't want to overwhelm people with a history lesson or just get into the cypherpunk stuff. I know it's important, but we can also talk, we can either go back further, and I can talk about what I think are the original philosophical ideas that undergird the network state movement, or we can talk more about where we're at now and how this thing is so far panning out, right? Because I think a lot of people, they hear network state and they just think Balaji, and that's all that's happening, when really it's this diaspora of crypto people and tech people who are doing this at scale.
Well, just so you know, you're not going to overwhelm people on this channel with a history lesson. Like, the people here are very used to 2, 3, and sometimes 4 or 5 hour discussions. So, like, this is not
Oh,
a,
that's true.
yeah. So, go for it. If you want to delve into the history, that is up to you.
Cool. Yeah, I think we have time. We'll talk about this for a bit, and then we can get into the actual the setting and the landscape, because I want to be able to provide people with the kind of the solution and what's happening, and where this also goes into is talking about a lot of what people are referring to as the black pill, this sense of nihilism and lack of meaning, which is I think a relevant part of this
Right.
discussion. Okay, so I refer to myself philosophically as a panarchist, typically, even more so than I refer to myself as an agrist. So a panarchist is, or panarchy as an idea is a meta political theory, right? And all it says is that there are contractual arrangements, right? Whether that's a verbal contract or a written contract that people can engage in, right? And they do that all the time anyway. And so in the context of governance, what this means is that people, no matter where they live, anywhere around the world, should be able to opt in to whatever kind of governance contract model that they want. It could also be non-governance, right? Because that can also be kind of a contract. And they should be able to do this without moving physically, right? So this is also, if we think about the crypto anarchist view of these network states, that's like opting into a governance model, more of an anarchist, quote unquote, governance model. And I want to be clear too. So a lot of people, when they hear me say governance, they think about government, right? Government is, of course, a group of guys who have a monopoly on force. And there's a few different definitions, but typically guys who have a monopoly of force over a large territorial region and then try to control various institutions with the use of that force. So I think, generally speaking, from an anarchist point of view, most of us agree with that general definition. But without getting too deeply into that, under panarchy, governance just means ways to resolve conflicts, ways to figure out how to get along, and an understanding of the direction of your particular ecosystem or society and how to get it there. So the key here is governance is an operation or a framework that you voluntarily opt into. It's just a contract, right? So if I want to be part of Ancapistan, I can go to Ancapistan. If I want to be part of anarcho-communist enclave or a syndicalist enclave, I can do that. Or if I want to live under a tyrant or a dictator, I should be able to do that as well. So this is the thesis of panarchy. It's non-normative, so it means there's not value embedded in the philosophy itself. It just says that we should all be able to choose what kind of communities, what kind of groups, and what kind of people we want to engage with, and that we want to enact rules with together as a community. So I think people can very clearly see the idea of panarchy and how it very much fits into this network state idea, because we're already opting in. A lot of us are opting into these different communities in the cloud. And just an example of this, so we'll just use Bitcoin as a great example of this. So Bitcoin is, aside from being a cryptocurrency technology and a payment system technology, it's also a governance apparatus. It's a community that shares values, that also make decisions leveraging consensus within the context of a network, right? So that is in a way, that is an initial panarchic enclave of a community that shares a value, at least around a particular cryptocurrency token, right? Or coin, in this case, Bitcoin. So, and just a little background information on panarchy. Panarchy was originally discussed it was written about in 1860 by a Belgian philosopher and botanist. His name was Paul-Émile Dupuit, and the paper he wrote is just called Panarchy. You can read all about this philosophy, and a lot of people have written about it if you go to panarchy.org. And that's where I've gotten a lot of my information from. I have that link saved, and I use it all the time. I read a lot of panarchist material. But one of my favorite things about this philosophy, aside from the fact that it's very anarchic in nature, in the sense that it suggests that we should be able to live how we want, where we want, and with who we want, it's the fact that it promotes experimentation in our social organization. It promotes the idea that we can, when we go into these communities, it's up to us and our communities to figure out and to determine what works for us and what doesn't. And then exit costs, because of the nature of it, are kept extremely low. Exit and switching costs are kept low. We can leave as we see fit, and we can join the communities of our choice that match our values more closely. So it is one way to put it is it's a competitive market for evolving governance frameworks and network state modalities, is the way that I look at it. And there's a lot. I also recommend everyone, if they want to understand sort of the governance and experimentation aspect of it and how that would kind of work itself out theoretically, there's a guy who wrote a piece called The Unbundled State. His name's Trent McDonald. And that's a really good starter piece, I think, on. He doesn't actually use the terminology for panarchy, but he's considered a panarchist, and his material, his writing is all over the panarchy.org website. So that's highly recommended.
Yeah.
So that's a bit, and so we'll see where you want to go.
Well, and that, so the thing that I do want to touch on, because like I'm a cynical asshole, you know this. We've been mutuals for a really long time. And so whenever I hear a phrase, I'm always liable to look into like the kinds of people espousing it, the kinds of people associated with it, the kinds of people associated with its like sort of underpinnings and ideas. And like for instance, you distinguished yourself, and I want to go over a few potential distinctions between you and some other people who also are affiliated with similar kinds of things. Let's get briefly into what separates your mentality from somebody like Yarvin, because I don't like that guy.
Absolutely. This is a really important discussion, and it's definitely justifiable to speak on this.
Yeah, so what would distinguish like your approach to network states from sort of Yarvin's more like Silicon Valley kind of NRX bullshit?
Yeah, man. Good questions. Okay, so Yarvin is, I mean, he refers to himself as a neo-monarchist. He's been referred to as others. Maybe he even refers to himself as a neo-reactionary, very hard right mindset. And hard right to the extent that he believes that there should be a technological rulership. You know, if you think back to Plato's The Republic, he talked about philosopher kings needing to
Mm-hmm.
rule over the unwashed masses, right? So this is just Plato revised in the form of technofascism, right? Where there's got to be a technological ruler ruling over a particular community or country, or we could even refer to it as a network state. So I would say the primary difference between what I'm advocating and what he's advocating, if we're talking about, you know, a panarchist type of worldview, is that you can have a Yarvin-esque community if you want, right, under the panarchic thesis. But the key is that exit costs would be kept low in a panarchist environment, right, theoretically. And we can talk about what would if we wanted to get really, if we wanted to get granular and dive into the philosophical details and the potential contradictions, I'm happy to do that. But the idea under the panarchist viewpoint is exit and switching costs are kept so low that you can easily exit those communities and go to ones that suit your needs and your values. So Yarvin is more interested in being an authoritarian and preventing that, right? This also has to do with like erecting border walls, trying to keep people in, trying to keep certain people out, making exit and switching costs high. I haven't
Mm-hmm.
dove that deeply into the details of some of Yarvin's work, so I don't know what his exact perspective on that is. But the mindset that he harbors is certainly one of authoritarianism, right? Whereas this is the way things should be, right, or ought to be worldwide, where there's a techno-fascist type of leader or a techno-monarch who controls everything from the top down, right? There's no room for real experimentation. It's like kind of my way or the highway. And so this is one of the reasons why I think it's very important that we have institutions, and these institutions are emerging now, by the way, that provide influence and ingest research data, collect research data on what's working and what's not, on what leads to human flourishing, collective betterment, defined operationally, of course, and what provides more liberty for the species and what moves the dial forward, right? So people like Yarvin, there's those out there who kind of share his perspective, or they at least lean more toward and this is a light way to put it, a startup society founder mindset, or a startup mindset where
Yep.
there's a CEO guy at the top who's controlling everything hierarchically from the top down. That's fine. If you want to do that, you can do that with those communities. But we would say, if we're an organization who is, you know, promoting a data use case, right, and an influence over the way that these network states try to, or startup societies try to organize, we would say that exit costs need to be kept low, because that's one of the metrics that we're trying to gauge, right? So I mean, it's very clear to me that if you're open-minded to people coming and going as they see fit, and they want to, because they want to try out new experiments in governance or different ways of living, they should 100% be able to do that. And so this is a distinction. But if you want to trap people in, if you want to control people, if you have more of a dark triad type of personality, that is a more authoritarian, very less anarchistic mindset. So I think those are some of the key differences or traits, of course, with a million different gradients and nuances, depending on, you know, who you ask and how deep you want to go into and pick apart the details of each given philosophy. But that's
Yeah.
what I would say the difference is.
Well, and that sort of leads me into some other people here, because like um when people started to get into Yarvin, that I saw started to get into Yarvin, you know, because I've watched these sorts of transitions happen for a significant period of time now. I've been, you know, sort of eyes on these spaces for like, 15 years probably now. And like, I used to admire and respect some people who identified in the libertarian space, the anarchist space, and these people gradually started to glom on to people like Yarvin and their idea of the cathedral and Maleft and Mawokes, and all of this stuff came as part of sort of a cargo cult associated with his neo-reactionary bullshit. But like, similarly, there is a massive blind spot in the existence of people like Peter Thiel. And Peter Thiel is like somehow gets a pass from a significant amount of alleged libertarians and anarchists, because those people are oftentimes basically grifters, and they're not actually on board with libertarianism or anarchy. They just sort of use that as a foil term for what they actually want, which is like a right-wing government. Um, and Peter Thiel is everything these people should hate. He runs Palantir. It's a massive like Orwellian dystopian like spying apparatus that's literally named after a crystal that lets you see everything. So that's not fucking good. But a lot of right libertarians allegedly like this guy, despite the fact that he's doing this, despite he's on the steering committee for the Bilderberg Group. He's affiliated with all these organizations and people who suck. And he's a huge proponent of like the network state movement from his perspective. He's affiliated with
Apology.
like the land sort of parts of this movement like Prospera, and he's also affiliated with a significant amount of these sorts of like basically we're going to move into and plunder parts of the global south, and we're going to be aligned with administrations that would be friendly to that and people who would be friendly to that, like Trump and Musk. And those sorts of mentalities are creating a really, really bad name for network states. So, do you have, I guess, a response to explain Peter Thiel?
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. Those guys are just they're pseudo libertarians, right? Because Peter Thiel calls himself a libertarian. A lot of these guys do. The first thing that I think of too, and I'll get into a bit more of my personal perspective and how this irons out, plus the investment side of things. But there's this theory called Italian theory, right, or elite theory is another term for it. And if you follow, and the audience, I'm sure, follows Derek Brose's work, which is really, yeah, which is just completely fantastic work, which I try to keep track of. Anyway, he just recently did a video on elite and Italian theory, and one of my co-founders at Polis also is an expert on elite theory. And I think that theory is what we're seeing kind of come to fruition. Mark Andreessen was also recently on a show with, was it Joe Rogan? Yeah, I think it was Joe Rogan. And in the show, they talked about this same elite theory. And a lot of these guys who you're seeing, who we would consider part of the technocratic cancer cell that's currently metastasizing.
Good term.
Yeah, thank you. So these guys they believe in this idea of elite theory. And what elite theory is, there's a group of elites that emerge out of society, right? And these elites are dark triad personalities, sociopaths. They want to control society. They lie, they steal, they cheat. That's just the nature of government, right? As an anarchist, we know that. But in the elite theory view, the way to solve this isn't anarchy. It isn't freedom. Instead, it's a counter elite, a group that comes in to try to oust the elite in order to save humanity. So there's kind of a messianic complex, a messiah complex that these guys have, where they're coming in to save the rest of humanity. And I think that's where these techno-fascist type mentalities derive from. This is the idea. By the way, the book on this was written by a guy named Burnham, who talked about elite theory. I think the book's called The Machiavellians, right? And one of the guys that he quotes was one of these Italian, I don't remember his name, but the term that undergirds the theory is this iron law of oligarchy, right? And so the idea that there's always going to be some oligarch ruling over the population and his kind of contingent. So these guys have to come in and wipe them out, save humanity, enact better rules. But it ends up being the same thing that becomes a cycle that repeats itself, right, in their mindset. And I think it goes without really explaining in depth that we very strongly disagree with that mindset. But I brought this up to suggest that all these guys calling themselves libertarians who are in tech, who have this mindset, they're 100% not for freedom, and they're not really for what we're looking at when we talk about network states. And here's one of the problems. This is one of the this is directly to your question, Jeremiah. We don't even like the term network state, and we oftentimes try to disassociate ourselves from it. But one of the problems is also it's become a bit of an earwig, right, where everyone uses it, and it's goes easy off the tongue. Networks. Oh, sounds cool. But one of the terms, for instance, at Logos, what we're in, everyone at Logos, it's a large organization, privately funded, a very strong crypto anarchist core. Those guys, one term that we're using is cyber state, right? To invoke the crypto anarchist idea behind it. And also we're not pushing the idea that diplomatic recognition is the way to go, because all these guys like Teal, et cetera, who are in this space, they think that diplomatic recognition is a good thing, that you want to play at the big boys table. I mean, that's probably like a wet dream for these guys, where they can rule a society how they see fit, be the acting rulers and presidents, and control the political machinery of these network states, right?
Yeah.
So there's a bit of an opposition movement in the network state community and ecosystem itself, where crypto anarchists are actually saying, no, this is not right. And it also speaks to this point. This is huge historical stuff that I was talking about earlier, where Balaji left out all of this material about crypto anarchists and actively doesn't really like libertarians that much, even though he kind of has a little bit of a different view. But it goes to show that some of these ideas are being either pushed to the side or forgotten. I mean, it's a bit of, if we're using Orwellian language, it's a bit of a newspeak, right? Where this stuff's just being left out and being erased from history. So it's got to be people like us who come up and say, no, we set the record straight. These guys did not come up with this idea. Not only that, though, what they're doing is not in line with sort of the impetus behind this, where we're trying to actually generate more freedom and create experimentation and governance, actual parallel societies, not enclaves or societies where a counter elite rules over whatever the remnant of the population is. So that's a key point here. And again, there's quite a few people who have this mindset now. I do want to touch on this investment point that you had. It is 100% true that there is one very small circle of billionaire and mega millionaire investors who are investing in the space. Teal is one of them. Balaji, there's a few others. So the thing is that's interesting to me is these guys have invested in the space so far, and I want to just speak to Prospera for a minute, right? Because I've been to the island of Roatan. I've been to Prospera. I know the founders. I know the people involved. I don't know what their end game is, but I do know that they have a more of a legitimate libertarian mindset. My friend Max Borders ran the conference at Crypto Cities. I came and gave a talk. They have an eye toward decentralization. They want to have as much freedom and less government interference as possible. So, and this is just to say that I don't know how their contracts or how their arrangements with Teal are in terms of the investment, but it seems to me that most of the guys involved are actual libertarians and actually want to see more freedom. Now, what level of co-option can occur at Prospera over time? What level of involvement will Teal or these other guys have in it? Who knows? But I do know what Balaji has said, because I've spent more time with him. He's founded and seeded some other network states, and he wants these guys to go off and do their thing. Again, I don't know the details of their personal and private contracts, but I'm just giving you my experience and what I see from, being on the ground in the space. Other than that, there are actors out there who are wanting to fund and do things that are completely outside the scope of these guys, and that's what Logos is, right? And this isn't me chilling, just providing the facts. There's people out there who are strictly focused on the cypherpunk stuff. They don't want to provide an opportunity for the space or the ecosystem to get co-opted, and they want to have an opportunity to evolve the space in a certain direction. So there is hope for the space to go the right direction. But just like a lot of people claim with Bitcoin, which I think is partially true, right? Roger just wrote Hijacking Bitcoin. There's going to be actors, 100%, government agents, economic hitmen, people who come after these spaces to undermine them, to co-opt them, and to perform economic hits to destroy their infrastructure. And this is why cypherpunk and crypto anarchist values are so vital and so critical right now, and why the technology that we're building that provides the ability to go dark, or what Emir Taki called a dark forest, to have a dark forest, to have this canopy erected where cyber guerrillas can engage in building technologies that subvert the system without being easily detectable or easily attacked. So this is a really cool, I think, part of this experiment that we're looking at right now. But yeah, it's not going to be easy, and we're already under threat, and there's already actors in the world who want to try to subvert the movement or take it for themselves and push it a different direction.
Yeah, well, and the only reason I brought up those was like, the like the there's this organization called Pronamos. Pronamos Capital is like behind certain things. It's behind Prospera. It's behind Itana. It's behind Young Drung City, Praxis Society, Small Farm Cities in Africa, Afropolitan, Metropolitis, Metropolis in Palau. And like all of this stuff like is basically loosely funded by people like Andreessen and Teal. So like it's not necessarily a condemnation, but it's certainly like something to be concerned with.
Yes. So I mean, I have thoughts on this too. Okay, this is an interesting thing, and you're right. We have to be concerned with it. We have to think about it. I'm gonna give the benefit of the doubt for now, and this is why. So Pronomos, the founder of Pronomos is Patrick Friedman, and I know Patrick personally. He is and you're probably familiar with his father and grandfather, right?
Mm-hmm.
So David Friedman's his dad, who wrote The Machinery of Freedom, and Milton Friedman, the great economist, freedom-oriented economist, was his grandfather. So he comes from this kind of heritage or this lineage of freedom-oriented, at least on the kind of the right-leaning side, that is not like counter-elite oriented. So, and Patry still harbors those views. He wants to build projects and build network states that have more of a freedom orientation, or at least he wants to give them the ability to build whatever they want. So again, I agree with you 100%, Jeremiah. I think we should definitely keep a very close eye on how these projects grow, because they certainly could become contaminated or co-opted. And we certainly do need to make sure we have alternatives that get developed, like Logos, right? Like any of the, like DarkFi also, which Amir talked about, and Amir's hardcore. I love that guy to death.
Yeah,
So we
what
have
is DarkFi?
Yeah. So DarkFi is a project that was founded by Amir Taki. Amir is a hardcore revolutionary and anarchist. He actually fought in Rojava against the Syrians. And he helped Cody Wilson, by the way, who founded Defense Distributed in Texas, like the Ghost Gunner printer guy. And they founded a project called Dark Wallet early on. It was a dark, anonymized Bitcoin wallet. That project didn't end up panning out for various reasons. But the most recent project Amir started and has been working on a while now is DarkFi. So DarkFi is an anonymized smart contract platform, and I think they're finally in the phase where they're about to roll out their beta. I think they already rolled out what they refer to as Dark IRC, which is a completely anonymized new IRC style chat that you can actually use right now if you're a developer to communicate with other developers without any kind of way to collect any kind of data. So Amir's the kind of guy who puts his money where his mouth is. And I recommend anybody, if they're not familiar with Amir, to watch his talks. He speaks regularly. He's a good friend of mine and a really good guy who's out there to see us through to more freedom. But the overarching point is that there are these communities and these groups and organizations that are trying to spearhead a crypto anarchist development of cyber states, right, rather than the network states. And I'm not intending to change the subject to ignore it, but there is something I'm thinking about we need to talk about if you want, but I want to make sure that there's no other questions, because that's...
Yeah, I think we've addressed various things, like sort of a trust but verify kind of, like, be careful and sort of try to make your own thing to the best of your capability. Try to be decentralized away from the more centralist elements so that you can't be co-opted. I think that's pretty well described. So yeah, go for it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the thing that I want to discuss is sort of the overarching vision and how it could potentially play out. And I want to provide some evidence for that in terms of what we currently know historically. So one of the huge influences for the network state, cyber state side of the movement, and I think that's a good way to differentiate it, right? What crypto anarchists are working on, what we can call cyber states, and what maybe non-crypto anarchists are working on, we can call a network state, right? Maybe there's there's aspects of those that are synonymous, features and characteristics and such, but beyond the scope of this particular talk. So in the 1960s in Czechoslovakia, there was a movement called the Chartists, who were trying to not deal with the communist takeover, the communist regime. They felt that it was very controlling and authoritarian, and they didn't have access to a lot of goods and services and goods that they needed. Anyways, a really bad situation. This was in the 60s leading up to the 80s. The Chartists started what's called what they refer to as the parallel poli, the parallel polis. And in Czechoslovakia during the time, instead of like having direct protests against the system or enacting revolutionary violence, they created what Ivan Hiros and Vaclav Benda called the parallel polis, a second culture or a second society, where they created institutions and structures within the context of those systems, right, on the ground physically, and then maybe more immaterially with different types of writings and information, the spread of information. Actually, they had a reprinting service they called Samizdat, which was effectively information that had been censored that they republished through these secondary structures, these parallel structures, and pushed them out into society so that people would understand what the truth is. Now, check this out. This is really telling and so important. There's so many people who don't know about this. So this came to the Chartists and their fight against the communist takeover came to its culminating point in late 1980s, I think like 1989, in what is referred to historically as the Velvet Revolution. And as a result of their work with the parallel poli and building these secondary cultures, these parallel institutions and structures, they caused the communist regime to relinquish power voluntarily, right, in a mostly peaceful way. There were, over the course of that, some 40 years or whatever, 30 years. So over the course of that 30 years period, there was a few student shooting incidents that occurred. So there was some blood spilled over the time, but overall it wasn't like a completely bloody revolution where they had to do a coup, right, and overthrow the communist regime. Instead, as a result of everybody just ignoring and not confronting those power structures directly and building parallel institutions, they eventually just, they gave up because everyone stopped paying their taxes. Everyone stopped engaging with traditional structures because now they had their own. So you kind of see where this is going. We have historical precedent saying that what we're doing with network states is possible to create lasting and effective change right now.
Make
right?
the state obsolete.
Boom. Yep, that's right. Just a lot of people have talked about this in varying ways, like Larkin Rose in his book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, and a lot of his ideas. So there's other people too like Murray Bookchin, I think, and on the left discussed these ideas as well. But being able to not confront the power structures directly, but to outbuild it, to develop, to focus on your own communities and not to confront it directly. There's a lot of power in that. And this is, in a way, loose way, it was a bit more active, but Gandhi did something kind of similar. He didn't create parallel structures, but he did believe in satyagraha, right? Nonviolent resistance, which is it's a bit more of a direct form, but the idea of being nonviolent, generally speaking, works. But I think what they did in Czechoslovakia is just, it's not talked about and super underrated overall in terms of how we can confront these kinds of power structures. And it's part of what people are talking, Derek talks about. It's this exit and build idea is really what it's all about. Even if that exit is building institutions and structures within the territory that you live. And this is also, of course, plays back nicely into Panarchy, right? Because it's building institutional structures and formations without leaving your physical territory, right?
Right. And that's the thing. Like, one of the things that I primarily like, it's a pet peeve. It's not a deal breaker, but also, like, a lot of the people that came out of this have turned out to be kind of the people with whom I would take issue to some extent. So I think my deal breaker, not the thing you talked about, right? But not the deal breaker by them being who they are, but like deal breaking might happen later. The Free State Project has a shit ton of issues. And I think one of the primary issues that comes from something like the Free State Project is the idea that coalescing all in the same space is a good idea. It fucking ain't, and it never has been. Like, first off, let's say every libertarian in the U.S. moves straight to New Hampshire. Nuke. That's all you need. You just need one nuke, and then the entire liberty movement is gone. That's not a good idea. Or not even nuke. You could just poison the water. You could just reduce the infrastructure. You could do very easy little COINTELPRO things that fuck up the entire community because it's all in one space. You could say, hey, you can have New Hampshire and then wall it off from America and demand, like, that's its own state now. Well, you wanted no government? Congratulations. You have no government, and now you're cut off from the rest of us, and now we're going to wall you in, and you've got to use passports, and you got to pay our taxes and shit. It's not a good idea to constantly coalesce all of your fucking people into one place. And I've always thought that, and I get called the asshole because I'm being an asshole, but I'm not wrong. So like anything to me that I call it opening up pockets of freedom all over the world is like much better mentality than that. It's the actual decentralized thing. Don't, demand a secession. Don't say states' rights. States don't have any rights. Don't demand, some sort of national divorce as though breaking up the borderlines is going to solve our problems. It fucking won't. Make little pockets of freedom. So is that what you're saying primarily as the benefit and sort of the draw to you, the sort of crypto state, network state mentality?
Yeah, you nailed it tit for tat, right? So one of the things that's occurring, and so you have my blog, it's called Counter Governance, and one of the pieces that I wrote relatively recently, I guess it was maybe 4 or 5 months ago, is called on incrementalism. So one of the ideas here is that over time, these cyber states, right? They proliferate. And not only cyber states, but you also have, like in Mexico, you have a huge proliferation right now of intentional communities. Things like what Derek's doing with the conscious agora, the holistic agora. You have still micronations like the Kingdom of Bhutan that have kind of different rule sets. You have all this stuff sort of happening at once, and sort of how I envision it is that they all develop and they all grow, and then people start seeing that, oh, this is a thing, this is happening, right? We're still in the very early stages, but when people start trying to leave their homelands to go to these places, and I really do think there's going to be more of and we've seen a little bit of this after COVID, right, with what's called the Great Resignation, where people left work and then they traveled and became digital nomads. That's played very much into this movement as well. But I think we're going to continue to see an exodus and diaspora of nomadic type people who leave, and then they eventually settle or attempt to settle in some of these cyber states if they have physical territory, right?
Right.
So in this idea of on incrementalism, and what we're doing, and this is this sort of a similar thesis of what happened in Czechoslovakia, we're incrementally and gradually eroding the power of the nation state. And how this is happening is if they have a brain drain, right, and human capital flight, people leave and go to these other places. What that means is it's sort of forcing the nation state over time to become a market competitor, right? They can't just continue to treat everybody like shit over time because they're losing all. And this is also, I think, a sneaking suspicion of why the U.S. current regime is trying to kowtow, especially to the crypto industry, right? This isn't the full story, but they're really trying to get them. They're wooing them, right? They're trying to really get them involved in the administration, because there's already been a shit ton of crypto entrepreneurs and people who have relocated, right? They've exited. One of my good friends actually had a cryptocurrency business here called Crypto Space. I worked with him for a while. I did some of the risk management, we had to shut that organization down because of the regulatory scrutiny. It was just completely insane. Anyway, he booted up his company in Mexico. It's called CryptoMex. So all these folks leaving is not something that they actively want to see happen. So that's probably one of the reasons why there's this, and there's a huge theme of regeneration, right? Like cultural regeneration in the U.S., where it's make America great again. That the reason why these memes are so prevalent is because the U.S. and really the Western world is sounding its death knell, right? The money printing has reached a fever pitch. They're in a position where they don't have as much economic clout. I mean, China is way ahead in terms of manufacturing, ship manufacturing, metalwork, just a lot of industries. It's leading the charge. So this is sort of the twilight of the Western world. So they're trying to shore up whatever kind of power that they can, and they know that power is technological. So that's the reason why this is happening right now. But I think there's nothing they can do to stop the tsunami, right? You can't. It'd be like walking out onto the beach and holding your hand up to the water and hoping that it subsides. But I think we just have to keep pushing this. And I'm an optimist and a defensive accelerationist by nature, where we have to keep building and doing and acting and talking to create this change. So over time, this keeps happening and it keeps trending the way it is. It's very possible we put ourselves in a position to where governments actually start having to compete, and they can't have a monopoly on force, at least not in the way that they used to have it, right? Because now there's all these competing jurisdictions with all these different kind of cool rules, these cool mindsets, philosophies, way of living, cultures, mores, the whole nine yards. It all exists outside the scope of any given territory.
Right.
And even what's happening in cyberspace, right, in crypto, which has anti-fragile tech, is contributing to this, right? All the economic transactionality that's happening in crypto, for better or for worse, has definitely summoned up a tremendous amount of capital and value, and has captured that capital and value and taken it away from sort of the traditional financial system. And so that's also a big part of this network state, cyber state movement. That's why a lot of us refer to it as the crypto endgame. Actually, the Praxis guys, you mentioned Praxis earlier, they wrote an article on their website called the crypto endgame, which is this sort of this idea conceptualized.
Yeah, well, and see, so I'm not an optimist. I'm a pretty strong pessimist, as you know. And the reason I think they're doing a whole lot of this catering and kowtowing to tech and crypto and all of that is because of people like Yarvin and people like Thiel, and because Thiel owns the Trump administration.
Yeah.
Thiel owns Vance. He bought Vance a long time ago. Like when Trump was describing in his previous administration, his cabinet of Pentagon and all that stuff, all that stuff, he said that pretty much all of my guys are Palantir guys. You know, like the Pentagon loves me. I'm not so sure about the higher ups, something like that. And like that mentality, like it's this mentality that we have to go against the left and the parasites and the people at the bottom at all costs, because these commie lefty blah 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 blahs are destroying our freedom. And it's so often it boils down to the temporarily embarrassed millionaire mentality, that a lot of sort of Koch funded neoliberal leaning libertarian organizations sort of tend to be. So following that, I think that a lot of this cucking and kowtowing is less to get the freedom-minded people back and more to get the people who might be freedom-minded if they, found a better way, a less authoritarian way, one that acknowledged how bad Peter Thiel and Yarvin, etc. were. Instead of finding you, they'll be directed more toward a think tank controlled by Thiel or Musk, or one of these Carp through Palantir, like one of these terrible people who are. Palantir recently came out with a book And when he was doing the press tour for it, he referenced something in it that made it really easy to find. He said that it was in the book. He said that he used the verse in the Bible that, like, by your fruits you shall be known, to defend Henry fucking Kissinger, and say that it doesn't matter whether or not you're doing good things, as long as your output is bigger than your input. That's all we care about. That's fucking evil. That's the
Yeah, it's
kind of
awful.
accelerationism that's going to accelerate us all into an early grave, or, if not, at least a technocratic, fascist surveillance superstate. And so
Yeah.
there needs to be an alternative. And that's why I'm glad that people like you are sort of trying to build that alternative, because the alternative to this structure is to recognize this structure. We are dealing with a fascist administration. Like, Trump is evil.
Yep.
And so is everybody associated with him, basically. They're not trying to draw in crypto investors like you. They're trying to draw in crypto investors like the people behind the Javier Milei rug pull, which literally is the same people who
Yeah.
did the Melania and Trump coins. So, like, and they're an AI company, they're a big tech company. They want, like, all these people basically want governments that run on AI. And all of this mentality is creating this, like, sort of, neo-fascist tech bro feudalist nightmare of oligarchy that controls from the top. They get a huge amount of profit, and then they dangle $5,000 checks in front of the proles' faces so that they stay invested. It's absolutely disgusting. So I think that's why they're doing it, and I'm glad to hear that you're trying to form an alternative to that.
Yeah, man. I think, yeah, they definitely have their reasons, but you're absolutely correct. There are those of us out there who understand what's happening. We work in the space, right? We work in tech. We realize where a lot of the funding's coming from, and there's a lot of us who 100% don't like it. And that matters the fact that we talked about Amir. He actually goes up on stage and talks and basically just shits on all of the ideas around VC handed money, right? Because and this is actually another important point to mention, something that's happening in our space generally in crypto, and it's interfacing with the cyber state movement as well. It's this idea of public goods funding, right? So there's a organization and blockchain project called Gitcoin. One of my friends, his name's David, runs a project called Funding the Commons. So a lot of what we're trying to develop, like technologically, to support these crypto anarchic cyber states are, I mean, they're mostly infrastructural level projects so that anybody can build applications on top of them. So it's very difficult to find ways to make those marketable, right? In terms of them gaining income, having an income, making money for themselves. So one of the things that a lot of us are looking at is how can we have like a regenerative kind of economy and like public goods funding that comes from other projects. So this is a huge project in the space to get us out of having to accept VC backed money, right? Which oftentimes can be easily cucked and co-opted, and that's definitely not what we want. And so how this is already happening through like grant projects and consolidated funding using things like quadratic funding and different kinds of blockchain based mechanisms to fund projects. And a lot of projects have gotten funded actually by Gitcoin. The problem right now is that it's very difficult to do this kind of like technological grassroots funding at very high volumes, and a lot of times it's just it has to be the community has to grow larger for the funding levels to get higher. But this is something that's also happening that's going to help get us out of having to be completely cucked by these individuals. So regenerative finance, public goods funding, infrastructure, all this stuff is also happening simultaneously. So this is one of the reasons why I try to maintain a sense of optimism, because I do see the threats on the horizon and that exist all around us very clearly. As an old school anarchist, I realize that the state and government is 100% not the way to go. But we definitely can't just sit on our asses and take the black pill and hope that. And I'm not saying that you're doing this by any stretch of the imagination. There's a lot of people out there, I think, because of what you're discussing and what even I a lot of times talk about as well. And what Derek is saying, a lot of anarchists have a tendency to focus on all the bad and all the downsides to what's happening, and the path that we're taking is going to lead to the extinction of our species. And I've seen this reach its fever pitch in people like Daniel Pinchbeck, who's more on the left, and basically wrote a post the other day that's saying that we're going to be extinct in 10 years because we're not addressing climate change. So all this, like, there's all this, like, this culmination of negativity, and it's all for good reason. But I have high hopes for the speed, because I see all of the technology and how it's coming to a head, especially in the realm of zero knowledge cryptography, which we talked about, crypto projects, crypto systems, as a path toward freedom and as an out to these fascist systems. And there's other technologies that are really, I know your feelings on AI, but there's all the thing that I can't really put my finger on, and I don't think that any one of us can fully grasp, is the impact that all of these different technologies are going to have on us ultimately in terms of where we go as a species, right? Because you have the culmination of biotech, longevity research, quantum computing, AI, and all of these fields, I throw these terms out here, but all these fields are actually making rapid advancement and developments. And now this is the other thing that we didn't really get into, but it's relevant to mention. A lot of these network states specifically are getting into special economic zones that also double as acceleration zones, where they're focusing very heavily on solving one single problem and advancing that particular field, right? Because now they're in a regulatory sandbox and they can kind of do a lot more than they could in the continental US or even in Europe. So, but I do think we do have to make choices. We have to work together with the right people to make choices on where we go as a species. And there does seem to be some evidence that there's more people thinking about how to solve problems outside using the traditional and legacy systems. And this goes back in all to the regenerative financing, regenerative economies, different way, like the lunar punk movement, et cetera. It's there, but it definitely needs to grow to have more of an impact. So there's, we have a choice as a species. We have to take the right path, and we have to try to stay as optimistic as possible. And just one tidbit, and we can talk a little bit about this before we end up calling it, but one of the things that's happening as a result of all this, right, or as a lead up to where we are now historically, is what John Vervaeke called the meaning crisis, that we're embedded in such a high interference, high technological dynamic that a lot of people are feeling more and more lost. They're feeling more disconnected from their fellow humans. They're feeling like alienated. And as a result, we've had a bit of a mental health crisis where suicide levels have been rising. Suicidality, anomie have all been rising.
Atomization.
There's just a general trend of melancholy throughout society at large. So one of my hopes, and this is a very important point to this whole discussion about, black pilled or clear pilled or white pilled, whatever have you, the network state, cyber state movement finally gives us an opportunity to come together with people that we can actually care about in smaller communities, where we can reconnect with human beings on a fundamental, very emotive level, and we can capture that, the spirit of that connection, in ways that we haven't been able to do previously, especially in recent past, where everyone's connected to their phone, they're connected to their devices, but now already in places like, this is not speaking to any of the other elements, but it's just saying that the people who have moved there, they're physically there together, they spend a lot of time together, they get to know each other in person, they do different kinds of activities. So there is a kind of a rekindling of the spirit, or even what Terence McKenna called an archaic revival of our reconnective tissue being embedded throughout society. And I think that's a great thing. But again, I want to be very clear. This isn't strictly ideology or the idea that we're trying to develop some type of utopia. It's the realization that there are bad things that can happen, and we can ultimately self-destruct and self-cannibalize. But there are the tools, the mechanisms, and the ideas. They all exist to put us on a path toward greater liberation, productivity, generativity, regenerativity. And I think that's a that's a great thing, and we should try to push toward that path, right? And that's the cool thing. We can, if we choose to take our work and our thoughts that direction. So
I've quoted this many a time before because I am a cynical, pessimistic
mhm.
asshole. Like I am Diogenes pilled. I am very much things suck and they're probably gonna get worse. But I'm also of the mentality that if you just leave it there, you're a cuck and a coward. And there's a quote from Robert Heinlein that I think sums up what you just said. It's certainly the game is rigged. Don't let that stop you if you don't bet you can't win.
Beautiful quote, my friend. Beautiful. Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess we're nearing, because you said 90 minutes was basically your upper threshold. We're nearing that. Is there anything you want to say to sort of cap this off, and like anything you want to say about your specific organizations that set them apart and sort of bring people to them?
Yeah, I kind of give my theory on where we're headed into the future, or what the preferable possible future can be. So you're familiar with James Joyce, I take it, right?
Mm.
Yeah, the Irish author wrote, right, Finnegan's Wake, Ulysses, but specifically I'm thinking the book that was kind of autobiographical that he wrote, called Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. In that book, made one of the most famous quotes, I think, in Western literature. It's that history is the nightmare from which we are trying to awaken. So I think if we solve the governance crisis, right, if we figure out how to build better collective sense-making tools, better conflict resolution tools, and we have the data to support that, and we can gear all of our activities toward collective betterment and human flourishing. In a way, the nightmare is really governance, right? And if we solve governance, we somehow escape history, because now we understand in a very granular way how our societies will generally unfold, right? We understand how they're going to work out, because people a lot of times talk about, you've heard this quote before, people talking about how democracy was this great, beautiful experiment, right, in government. But it really wasn't an experiment. It was just copy pasted all around the world as monarchies were toppled and just replaced by another form of control freakery, right?
Right.
So, and right now, in this moment, we have the ability to actually experiment with governance. We have the ability to prove our thesis in terms of what will work and what doesn't. And that's the thing that I'm most excited about. And that's the reason why I work in this space. And that's the glimmer of hope that I see for our future. But we have to get out of these cycles of bloody revolution after bloody coup after bloody revolution over and over and over again, right?
Absolutely.
And that's where I'm at, brother. And that's a great quote, by the way. Cool. Yeah. So this probably flows nicely into a pitch for an organization that I founded called Polis Labs. You can visit the website at polis-labs.com. We are a nonprofit, but we did not, and this will make very perfect sense to you from a principal perspective. We did not structure the organization as a 501(c) in the U.S., which is a nonprofit. Instead, we structured it as a nonprofit foundation out of Estonia, which is like has a digital governance
Estonia
model. Yeah. So that's where we structured it. We're all the things that I've talked about. We're actually doing where we're working. We're doing research more on the qualitative side, but we're going to do the quantitative side as well. We're actually going to be in Switzerland at the Zuzalu. We didn't even talk about Zuzalu today, but that's relevant. That's the cypherpunk like pop-up cities. Zuzalu in Switzerland, called Zoo Switzerland, and we're going to be doing some focus groups and stuff and starting to collect data on what's working in terms of their governance mechanisms and their sense-making apparatus. And so that we can start building out our database for this and understanding the direction of where these different communities are going. We have a few MOUs with a couple of other network states, some of them which Botbology funded. So the idea is that we can be influential in this space and let network states know that we have the data on what works and what doesn't. We can eventually offer governance frameworks that are high value, that are critical, and that the goal is that they lead to collective betterment and flourishing, defined around ideas like human liberty, individual happiness, domestic happiness, and metrics like that. I've written we've written a few articles on this site on Polis-Labs, but that's what that's my personal passion project I'm working on right now with my two co-founders who actually have had experience working in war zones and almost died a couple of times in Somalia and Afghanistan, doing mainly helping different kinds of companies establish. They realized ultimately that this is for the birds because the governments are all shit and corrupt. So they got into the network state movement, and so we partnered up because I have all the blockchain experience. But that's what I'm working on with Polis-Labs, and then secondarily, I also do work with Logos, who I mentioned a couple of times. Who Logos, those guys are hardcore developing infrastructure for very privacy centric, very anonymity and very human liberty oriented infrastructure for network states. And what I mean by infrastructure, decentralized data, privacy enhancing comms, communications, and consensus for network states so that you can do governance in the cloud, and eventually maybe tie that to the ground in some way as well. So those are the primary things, and you can find my Substack in Polis, and you'll have the other links. I don't have to go over all of them. I have a personal blog. I mentioned counter governance as well.
Yeah, everything should be linked in the description, I believe. And so yeah, so I guess then that'll be a reasonable place to wrap. What I'll say is, I hope everybody goes and checks out the rest of what Sterlin does. I hope to have maybe more parts to this discussion to delve into more of the tyranny aspects, and also delve into more of the stuff we might have missed today. So maybe there's a part 2 a couple months down the line. But generally speaking, yeah, there needs to be a change, and like, I thank you, Sterlin, for showing up to this channel and discussing what that change needs to be. Like, I'm hoping that this was a granular enough way to sort of approach this that, like, if anybody had any doubts that they might even want to check this out, this might give them reason to do so. Because, like, the general thing is, the elites want us fighting each other. They don't want us building our pockets of freedom. And they don't ever want us looking into things like this. So they want to keep people as far away from this as possible. They probably shadow ban the stream as well. Normally we get like 2 or 3 times this viewership. So my guess is that if people share this around, if people like, subscribe, etc., that this can start to be potentially a way to fight the system. So with all that being said, yeah, build your pockets of freedom. Try to get as many people on board as possible for, if not this, at least something. Because something's got to give, or we'll never smash the fucking state.
Love it, brother. Yeah, and thanks so much, Jeremiah, for having me on. I really enjoyed our conversation. I'll share on my channels and get the message out as well.
Absolutely, and thank you for showing up. This is a pretty blacklisted channel. I'm an evil person, according to so many. So, yeah. Any amount that anybody wants to sub and share, get this channel maybe closer to the center of the island instead of off in the waters on pirate radios. So be well, all. Smash the fucking state.
Cheers.